Ann Veronica listened with her eyes on the fire. "Everybody is taking it up," said Miss Miniver. "You had to come in. You couldn't help it. Something drew you. Something draws everybody, from suburbs, from country towns, everywhere. I see all the movements. As far as I can, I belong to them all. I keep my finger on the pulse of things." Ann Veronica said nothing. "The dawn!" said Miss Miniver, with her glasses reflecting the fire like pools of blood-red flame. "I came to London," said Ann Veronica, "rather because of my own difficulty. I don't know that I understand altogether." "Of course you don't," said Miss Miniver, gesticulating triumphantly with her thin hand and thinner wrist, and patting Ann Veronica's knee. "Of course you don't. That's the wonder of it. But you will. You will. You must let me take you to things, to meetings and things, to conferences and talks. Then you will begin to see. You will begin to see it all opening out. I am up to the ears in it all, every moment I can spare. I throw up work, everything. I just teach in one school, one good school, 3 days a week. All the rest, movements. I can live now on fourpence a day. Think how free that leaves me to follow things up. I must take you everywhere. I must take you to the suffrage people, and the Tolstoyans, and the Fabians." "I have heard of the Fabians," said Ann Veronica. "It's THE society," said Miss Miniver. "It's the centre of the intellectuals. Some of the meetings are wonderful. Such earnest, beautiful women, such deep-browed men. And to think that there they are, making history. There they are, putting together the plans of a new world. Almost light-heartedly. There is Shaw and Webb and Wilkins the author, and Toomer and Dr. Tumpany, the most wonderful people. There you see them discussing, deciding, planning. Just think, they are making a new world." "But are these people going to alter everything?" said Ann Veronica. "What else can happen?" asked Miss Miniver, with a little weak gesture at the glow. "What else can possibly happen, as things are going now?" Part 3. Miss Miniver let Ann Veronica into her peculiar levels of the world with so enthusiastic a generosity that it seemed ingratitude to remain critical. Indeed, almost insensibly Ann Veronica became habituated to the peculiar appearance and the peculiar manners of the people in the van. The shock of their intellectual attitude was over. Usage robbed it of the first quaint effect of deliberate unreason. They were in many respects so right. She clung to that, and shirked more and more the paradoxical conviction that they were also somehow, and even in direct relation to that rightness, absurd. Very central in Miss Miniver's universe were the Goopes. The Goopes were the oddest little couple conceivable, following a fruitarian career upon an upper floor in Theobald's room. They were childless and servantless, and they had reduced simple living to the finest of fine arts. Mr. Goopes, Ann Veronica gathered, was a mathematical tutor and visited schools, and his wife wrote a weekly column in New Ideas upon vegetarian cookery, vivisection, degeneration, the lacteal secretion, appendicitis, and the higher thought generally, and assisted in the management of a fruit shop in the Tottenham Court Road. Their very furniture had mysteriously a high-browed quality, and Mr. Goopes, when at home, dressed simply in a pyjama-shaped suit of canvas sacking tied with brown ribbons, while his wife wore a purple dijbah with a richly embroidered yoke. He was a small, dark, reserved man, with a large and flexible-looking convex forehead, and his wife was very pink and high-spirited, with one of those chins that pass insensibly into a full, strong neck. Once a week, every Saturday, they had a little gathering from 9 till the small hours, just talk and perhaps reading aloud, and fruitarian refreshments, chestnut sandwiches buttered with nut toast, and so forth, and lemonade and unfermented wine, and to one of these symposia Miss Miniver, after a good deal of preliminary solicitude, conducted Ann Veronica. She was introduced, perhaps a little too obviously for her taste, as a girl who was standing out against her people, to a gathering that consisted of a very old lady with an extremely wrinkled skin, and a deep voice, who was wearing what appeared to Ann Veronica's inexperienced eye to be an antimacassar upon her head, a shy blond young man with a narrow forehead and glasses, 2 undistinguished women in plain skirts and blouses, and a middle-aged couple, very fat and alike in black, Mr. and Mrs. Alderman Dunstable, of the Borough Council of Marylebone. These were seated in an imperfect semicircle about a very copper-adorned fireplace, surmounted by a carved wood inscription, "Do it now." And to them presently added a roguish-looking young man with reddish hair, an orange tie, and a fluffy tweed suit, and others who, in Ann Veronica's memory, in spite of her efforts to recall details, remained obstinately just others. The talk was animated, and remained always brilliant in form, even when it ceased to be brilliant in substance. There were moments when Ann Veronica rather more than suspected the chief speakers to be, as schoolboys say, showing off at her. They talked of a new substitute for dripping in vegetarian cookery that Mrs. Goopes was convinced exercised an exceptionally purifying influence on the mind. And then they talked of anarchism and socialism, and whether the former was the exact opposite of the latter or only a higher form. The reddish-haired young man contributed allusions to the Hegelian philosophy that momentarily confused the discussion. Then Alderman Dunstable, who had hitherto been silent, broke out into speech and went off at a tangent, and gave his personal impressions of quite a number of his fellow councillors. He continued to do this for the rest of the evening intermittently in and out among other topics. He addressed himself chiefly to the Goopes, and spoke as if in reply to long-sustained inquiries on the part of the Goopes into the personnel of the Marylebone Borough Council. "If you were to ask me," he would say, "I should say Blinders is straight, an ordinary type, of course." Mrs. Dunstable's contributions to the conversation were entirely in the form of nods. Whenever Alderman Dunstable praised or blamed, she nodded twice or thrice according to the requirements of his emphasis, and she seemed always to keep one eye on Ann Veronica's dress. Mrs. Goopes disconcerted the alderman a little by abruptly challenging the roguish-looking young man in the orange tie, who, it seemed, was the assistant editor of New Ideas, upon a critique of Nietzsche and Tolstoy that had appeared in his paper, in which doubts had been cast upon the perfect sincerity of the latter. Everybody seemed greatly concerned about the sincerity of Tolstoy. Miss Miniver said that if once she lost her faith in Tolstoy's sincerity, nothing she felt would really matter much any more, and she appealed to Ann Veronica whether she did not feel the same. And Mr. Goopes said that we must distinguish between sincerity and irony, which was often indeed no more than sincerity at the sublimated level. Alderman Dunstable said that sincerity was often a matter of opportunity, and illustrated the point to the fair young man with an anecdote about Blinders on the Dust Destructor Committee, during which the young man in the orange tie succeeded in giving the whole discussion a daring and erotic flavor by questioning whether any one could be perfectly sincere in love. Miss Miniver thought that there was no true sincerity except in love, and appealed to Ann Veronica, but the young man in the orange tie went on to declare that it was quite possible to be sincerely in love with two people at the same time, although perhaps on different planes with each individual, and deceiving them both. But that brought Mrs. Goopes down on him with the lesson Titian teaches so beautifully in his Sacred and Profane Love, and became quite eloquent upon the impossibility of any deception in the former. Then they discoursed on love for a time, and Alderman Dunstable, turning back to the shy, blond young man, and speaking in undertones of the utmost clearness, gave a brief and confidential account of an unfounded rumor of the bifurcation of the affection of Blinders that had led to a situation of some unpleasantness upon the Borough Council. The very old lady in the antimacassar touched Ann Veronica's arm suddenly, and said in a deep, arch voice, "Talking of love again, spring again, love again. Oh, you young people!" The young man with the orange tie, in spite of Sisyphus-like efforts on the part of Goopes to get the topic on to a higher plane, displayed great persistence in speculating upon the possible distribution of the affections of highly developed modern types. The old lady in the antimacassar said, abruptly, "Ah, you young people, you young people, if you only knew!" and then laughed and then mused in a marked manner, and the young man with the narrow forehead and glasses cleared his throat and asked the young man in the orange tie whether he believed that platonic love was possible. Mrs. Goopes said she believed in nothing else, and with that she glanced at Ann Veronica, rose a little abruptly, and directed Goopes and the shy young man in the handing of